Hello everyone, today we talk about 13th century Bohemia. It's a mere coincidence for me to have started the series about the Battle of Marchfeld from my master thesis that will last likely tens of videos for your delight. I knew, of course, that there was more Bohemian history incoming from the cycle sort of random lottery. Here we are discussing actually some historical background that will be incredibly useful for the aforementioned series as well. It's neither the first time we talk about 13th century Bohemia, for that matter. I created a historical original series video dedicated exactly to that. You know that we have our playlists quite tightly organized with quite substantial amount of Czech history at this point. We'll keep expanding on. There isn't just Hussitism in medieval Bohemia. Actually, in fact, these previous centuries, in my opinion, are by far the most interesting. The 13th and 14th as well, being properly the peak. Premyslid, Ottokar I, not the second, we will conclude the video with 1197-1230, leveraged Bohemia's status as the most significant region within an empire diminished by the death of Henry VI. A great way to start the century, right? Say Ottokar I of the Premyslid dynasty, that, as you know, was probably the founder of Bohemia in a political sense, bore the title of Kurfürst, that is to say, cup-bearer, a very important institutional office in the Holy Roman Empire. And he engaged in imperial elections, of course, as one of the most powerful electors, right? Way before Charles IV, in fact, of Luxembourg, king of Bohemia, other than just Holy Roman Emperor, was, issued regulated, if anything, in more strict ways, typical of the ancient regimes, the individual electoral princes of the empire, with Bohemia being one of them among the lay ones. Indeed, the power of the country had already reached that level. We'll talk more about this, in fact, earlier periods of what was actually a prince elected by the 11th, the 12th, the 13th century. It's something that developed along the way, but Bohemia was rising as an incredibly important landmass. First of all, there is, in this later high Middle Ages, a dramatic demographic and economical expansion that the Premyslids will be quite capable of riding. From a country that actually wasn't really, as we've seen in other videos, just by the fact of being essentially a Central European one, but also a more distant from civilization. So one that had been just integrated in the moment as a kingdom within the same German world at the end of the day. This is not what the Poles or the Hungarians will experience, right? In 1198, Ottokar I himself, among the various things, secured the hereditary title of King of Bohemia through the Golden Bull of Sicily issued by Emperor Frederick II, which granted him and his successors permanent royal status, which had not been a thing up to that point. There had been dukes and occasionally kings, elevating Bohemia's position within the Holy Roman Empire for good, because essentially that's what the country remains institutionally within the Holy Roman Empire. This is quite relevant because essentially the 13th century witnesses a great crisis within Germany. That was a much bigger country, right? Bohemia, in perspective, was just, even though as a Slavic country and heavily Germanized at this point, but still as a kingdom, just an equivalent, right, by provincial scale, essentially, of the historical stem duchies of Germany, right? Perhaps something more, given that it was, if anything, more unitarily led. This was an actual advantage that the Czechs had at this point, that the Premyslid dynasty had succeeded, regardless of the obvious dynastic disputes, to basically contain the latter within the dichotomy Bohemia-Moravia, so that basically the senior branch, and more often, like, I don't know, the father, right, ruled as king of Bohemia within the Premyslid house, and the son and successor, or the brother initially, as Margrave of Moravia. The clash would be essentially an ethnic nobility that was quite, of course, jealous of their own autonomies and prerogatives. So it's all very typically Middle European in terms of general sabotage of monarchic power. However, the game was more contained by, first of all, probably at this point, the irreplaceability of the Premyslid dynasty. It was such, we'll talk about this especially in the series about the Battle of Marchfeld, such a prestigious, spiritual, sacred deal for these houses to have founded, like, I don't know, the Piasts in Poland, the Arpads in Hungary, such powerful polities. And Bohemia, complex the fact it was a bit smaller, in general, had succeeded to maintain, in fact, even a more compact form of government. I mean, look at the PS and the ducal seigniorate. It was more similar to the Kievan Rus, right, than the Western Slavs. Also, the Hungarian kings with all those Magyar oligarchs scattered in what was essentially an imperial dominion had lots of issues. So there was also another factor to consider in here, that is these, in fact, Western Slavic powers in general had not been feudalized yet by the extent that, for example, Germany had, right? Germany, as we know, we've made lots of videos on, will go under, during this century, the Great Interregnum. And Bohemia would actually take advantage of that, but why, right? It's a bit like what happened to the Western Franks, except earlier in times, because paradoxically, this is the game. At the time, also, the Eastern Franks hadn't been particularly feudalized, and the feudal system creates a glue that eventually consolidates a state, institutions, a monarchy, right? And it will take, Germany will explode a bit like all the Central European countries, although in some kind of more, at least it was a bigger country, was more difficult to keep together, and true provincial, princely, private power, there will be a compaction, paradoxically, mostly outside of Germany. Think about the Habsburgs or the Hohenzollern in Hungary or Prussia, for example. The Czechs in particular are experiencing this great favorable conjunction of different factors. The fact that all these countries, they were the closer to civilization through Germany, that was at this point, right, really expanding a lot, right? Even in, maybe even more in the collapse of the national monarchy, was sort of by, say, being so overloaded like an atom fusion, right, that invests through these radiations the entire surroundings. Well, Bohemia is the best placed of these ones, and yet the military center of Kutná-Hora, for example, is still relatively far from being fully exploited. So it's not much that. It's just mostly a political issue. All of Europe is experiencing important growth, and these countries in Central Europe arrive a bit later, right? The greater demographic concentration was, of course, in countries like Western and Southern Europe. However, while the latter were increasing, for sure, and they were bigger, in relative terms, the Central European countries were growing more, right? They had a sort of, if you want, more volatile growth, except for Germany, that will really sediment a lot at this point, and depending on different countries and different times, but a pretty sudden one, right? It was favored in part by, as we've seen, the lack of specific restrictions, and that were not really a positive thing in the broader framework of political unity. But in the case of Bohemia, as we've seen, they had this dynastic and sort of territorial advantage. Plus, definitely a heavily destabilized and pretty big system like Germany just next to them, right? As you have understood here by the concessions of Henry VI, with his son Frederick II, the Bohemians had been historically aligned with the Swabians, right? They had been important allies. They had served, say, under Frederick Barbarossa in Italy with military contingents. They had really proven to be part of the system, and now they were properly recognized as fully fledged kings within the Holy Roman Empire, which is a big deal. Naturally, Bohemia was a foreign country in as much as it was Slavic, regardless of the Ostsiedlung. It was heavily Germanizing its outskirts mostly. But in this sense, it was an equivalent, if you want, to, at least from an institutional standpoint, to Germany, to Italy, to Burgundy, right, within the empire. The Bohemian had contributed to the Hohenstaufen's cause thanks also to their position. Like East Germany was tendentially sort of more centrifugally escaping at least an attempt of centralization by the Swabian rulers that at this point are actually, again, with the death of Henry VI, with the minority of Frederick II and the struggles, Otto of Brunswick and so on, really having a great difficulty in to pursue that national monarchic goal. They are, in a sense, part of the ways the Bohemians will expand. Were the ones that also these other German houses, including the imperial one, had tried to do, such as seizing Austria. All right, Frederick II would have done everything possible to have just Swabia, Austria, surrounding Bavaria, creating an entire Alpine arc under imperial control, so to facilitate the Mediterranean Roman policy. The Bohemians, however, and those northeastern parts of Germany were the more also countercultural one in this, as we've seen with Otto of Brunswick. As soon as one of their princes would rise to the royal and imperial title, they would do exactly the same identical thing that the Swabians were doing. But in this case, it wasn't yet the matter. At least the thing would resolve itself with Otto of Brunswick. As you know, we made lots of videos about Bohemia. We'll come back also as far as the Italian-Sicilian war against Frederick II, against the papacy as well, which is sort of underrated. But historically, Swabia, of course, was in the southwest, so some of the most Romanized, developed, even warm areas of Germany. The north and the east had historically been more hegemonized at this point by the Welfen and by other powers that were trying essentially to back that autonomism against that northwestern power, that included also Franconia historically. So having as behind these opponents the Bohemians, just from that side of Germany, naturally facilitated the alliance between the Premyslids and the Hohenstaufen, hence all these recognitions and their increase in power. Right. Ottokar I's authority to propose episcopal candidates granted by imperial sanction was ceded to the Bishop of Prague in 1222. Other important aspect that obviously shows the growth of the Czech church, and so the strengthening mostly also of an ecclesiastical support to the monarchy, that obviously was a bit of a leitmotif, at least of feudal monarchies as they were historically expanding, and this is the case for Bohemia as well. As always, there is the monarchic attempt to curb the ethnic nobility, the lay aristocracy, right? The church tendentially is less militarized and as such requires monarchic protection. Besides, the church cannot be inherited, cannot be owned, cannot be split, etc. So that's a major asset to base also the monarchy on and sort of propping each other in the process. In 1211, Ottokar I issued a charter confirming the privileges of the Prague bishopric, granting it control over the cathedral chapter's appointments, thereby strengthening also ecclesiastical autonomy, but also it's always the same thing, like conferring more rights, but as we just explained, actually tying ever more through, in fact, the royal authority that issued that, the church to monarchic power in Bohemia. In 1290, in very different times, but still at Nuremberg, Rudolf of Habsburg, after having actually defeated the Bohemians and having essentially established a protectorate over them, acknowledged Václav II that the Bohemian king should advise the king of the Romans and emperor as Kurfürst, not in his capacity as king, right? This is also again relevant because it shows how at that point the Bohemian monarchy had taken an important blow. Ottokar II. So here we are switching a bit from a generation to another across the 13th century, but the progression. This was, in fact, the most powerful ruler at the head of some of territories, as we will see now, that had basically been the largest ones ever owned within the Holy Roman Empire up to that point, being defeated by Rudolf of Habsburg at the Battle of Marchfeld in 1278, which is the topic of my series and thesis back in the day. And that's yet the other aspect you want to take in consideration, because Ottokar II nearly claimed the imperial throne before, of course, the worried German princes elected Rudolf of Habsburg, initially as, say, a poor count, as the same Ottokar II sort of smeared him, but propping him against the Czech ruler, as he had, in fact, secured an enormous amount of territory, mostly in southeastern Germany, on top of this major Bohemian country. Again, it's a very important landmass, a quite sort of central country in this game, and the most cohesive, most politically united, right? Ottokar II being the incarnation of that. We're talking southern Austria, Carantania, and Styria. I'm making it simple because there were lots of other different chunks, but the thesis, as we say, will speak enough for that, as you will see. Now, in 1260, Ottokar II formalized his control over Styria through a treaty with Bela IV of Hungary, following the Battle of Kressenbrunn, where the Bohemians had won, also thanks to the support received by the Viennese, right, that preferred the Bohemians to the Hungarians, and of course the local Austrian nobility that in general, because Vienna was starting to be at this point really a very important center, right? Before the 12th century, we don't even know too much about Vienna from, say, ancient times, but at this point it's growing, like similar to what we explained also with this neighboring lands, a big deal, and becoming essentially the cornerstone of an Austrian province, which stipulated that Styria would remain under Bohemian rule, though this would be later contested. Bohemians and the Hungarians had really clashed against one another quite strongly. Kressenbrunn was the great triumph of Ottokar II. It's a pretty interesting battle. We will surely make a video about that as well, because it really deserves. There had been old rivalries, naturally, between the Bohemians, the Magyars, the Germans in this area, dating since ever, right, the migration era. We have partially seen those as well. But at this point, what we're really witnessing before the rise of Rudolf of Habsburg is a major power vacuum, right, after the death of Conrad of Swabia especially, and during the so-called interregnum, as the Roman kingship of Alfonso of Castilla and Richard of Cornwall was not particularly impressive, of course, and in fact gave free reign basically to the various princes of the empire, including the Bohemians, to basically take over those public rights that already the late Swabians had been forfeiting for creating in their own their own exact own way as we've seen, private dominion based just on the fortunes of their clans. And especially southeastern Germany does not quite have a major force holding this together, which is paradoxical because these lands had been quite well put together by the House of Babenberg, that, as we will see now, Ottokar famously had sort of married into, so de facto inheriting at least part of the house's land through his wife. He was married thrice. But there was also another claimant to to the throne. There is even a Ruthenian involvement through the Hungarians, and basically there were different heiresses that called the respective protectors, giving, in fact, a life to the Battle of Cressenbrunn, which was the major showdown to settle this matter. And Ottokar had won in arms and gloriously enough. Vienna, important logistical center, supported the feudal army that Ottokar had been mustering. Also, thanks to the support of various German rulers, especially in the northeast, the Saxons were Ottokar's favorites, that were working ever more, as we explained before, to finally demolish further the stability of the German crown. However, the interregnum, at least in this sort of didactically conceived way, ended when, because there had been rulers, as we've seen, and kings of the Romans, and the next ruler would not be a Holy Roman Emperor, still king of the Romans. When, in fact, Rudolf of Habsburg, Rudolf I, was elected as, again, king of the Romans. In de facto, it's the same thing as emperor, but not quite in some broader political, say, official and sort of far-reaching fashion. We're in 1273. And Ottokar was immediately adverse to him. He had voted as elector against him, had also prompted different other electors to go against him. And we will see that phase in our special series, right? And in other videos like these, at some point we will enter properly that story. And he thus openly vied for dominance within the empire, because for a long time, for years, he would not actually recognize Rudolf's election. You could simply, as an incredibly powerful prince, the Aureus et Ferreus Rex, as he was really called, to simply turn from the other side and, who cares about you, Rudolf of Habsburg? I don't even owe you anything. At some point they will meet, and Rudolf had this sort of typically Habsburgically pious, but in that sense tight-fisted way of receiving homage from this magnificently dressed and armed Czech ruler, while wearing himself just like a leather jerkin of some sort, which was an enormous offense, of course, to Ottokar. But here, as we will see now, also in the general background, lots of sort of malaise was brewing. The Germans began to repent to have given too much power to Rudolf, as we will see now, especially after the War of 1276. Also, some other families, think about the Wittigonen, that will later become the Rosenberg, were a Moravian family. They were normally opposed, as we were saying before, to the Bohemian monarchy within the same kingdom. And they were also close to Austria because, there's just this frontier north of the Danube that is a bit like this crossroad between Hungary, Austria, today is also Slovakia, well, at the time would be Upper Hungary, Moravia, etc. And that's where the Marchfeld is. The Battle of Wagram was fought, right, in a broader regional sense, right? It triggers me when they say, they found yet another grave of soldiers of the Napoleonic era on the Marchfeld yet, but do you want to acknowledge, as we have also understood by now, that there is a massive amount of Bohemian knights intact under the riverbed of the Moravia, in the exact place where we know that the last clash of the battle took place, that Marchfeld took place, that could be, in theory, dug out, right, and admired in all their magnificence. That would have been really something to see. In 1276, Rudolf of Habsburg declared Ottokar II's Austrian and Styrian possessions forfeit at the Diet of Augsburg, citing his refusal to swear fealty, as we were remembering, escalating their conflict. In fact, there was a fully fledged war where basically Rudolf, and this is a thing also with his son Albert, who will, in this time of German military history, become famous for their, not much Bewegungskrieg, that would be the proper term, but an actual blitzkrieg, because they were incredibly good at forced marches, And essentially Rudolf managed to take over Vienna, and so basically southeastern Germany, without even coming to an open confrontation, or at least an actual battle eventually with Ottokar. In fact, he made this feint of attacking from Eger, that is just basically on the frontier with Bohemia, and Bohemia is just like is squeezed. And imagine the left, and from that side there is Eger in Germany, and instead he circled around in southeast and southwest and arrived to Vienna. And at that point, Ottokar understood the thing. He also launched his army at forced marches, but the roads in Bohemia were not that much. And he arrived, basically the two armies met on the Danube. And during the negotiations, Ottokar even tried to to take by surprise Rudolf's camp. He failed, and he had to stand down, and he lost basically all that incredibly precious southeastern German territories that eventually will become the Habsburgic Erbländer, or at least, the Habsburgs were originally of Alsace, of Switzerland, and so on. But they had made this jump, right? They were, I think, the first ones, because eventually you have the Luxembourgs in Bohemia that are called, by the way, to counter the Habsburgs at the extinction of the Premyslid dynasty in the early 14th century. The Angevins in Hungary, in Poland. So I have this sort of very interesting moves that actually tie up with what I was saying before regarding the fact that Germany had become this intricate feudal mess that was sort of too difficult to tame. Rudolf will try at some point, as we said also in the last video about the Battle of Marchfeld. He would go on destroying up to 70 castles in the Rhineland to tame those rebellious princes. And you understand, he tried that in the West. It was historically, of course, the most developed part of Germany, together with the South, that the same Habsburg, in the sense, had secured, at least in some parts. This normally Bavaria sides with the Bohemians, so it's a bit a problem also for communications that from Alsace they have to pass through the Alps. So Ottokar remained in Bohemia for a couple of years. He had other connections. He was very tight with Poland. He had the city of Königsberg in Prussia on the Baltic that was founded properly in his honor. He is the king of the Königsberg. So there is a lot. Actually, there isn't, say, this earlier, events are quite important. So obviously we know a lot, as you understand, also from my account. And I'm really making it simple. But we don't even have, however, a strongly narrating voice from the Czech side, right? And the few, even probably within the Capitulary of Prague, that, as we've seen, had been blessed by the Premyslids historically, do not quite fully embrace even Ottokar's figure, and or at least point out that the eventual failure of his policy, and he's together with his demise, was naturally a pretty sad thing for Bohemia, not quite explaining how that had come to be. And we will see this also in analyzing the sources of the Battle of Marchfeld. The Battle of Marchfeld, also known as the Battle of Dürnkruth and Jödenspeigen in 1278, more or less at this period of the year, at the end of August. So, in fact, the defeat and death of Ottokar II was also recognized by Rudolf as fighting till the end with a gigantic soul. Ottokar was really a great king, but great in the now essentially Slavo-Germanic, feudal, and partially even Romanly ambitious sense of the war. We're not talking about the clashes between, the vassalatic beneficiary Germans versus Slavic tribes. Here we're talking about a king that was fully, properly contextual to the Holy Roman Imperial system, policies, and more. And there is the famous German verse of the Cantilena de Regia Bohemia, so this, song of the Bohemian king. It says, "The Bohemian king has fallen, eyes weep and stream with grief. The king died just like a knight who always fought honorably." right? And this was absolutely true. And we will make the video about the Battle of Marchfeld will be beautiful. Also through this the Styrian rhyme chronicle, you will really see what happened on that battlefield and how Ottokar dramatically died, by the way. So as a result, Bohemia, so we are at the end of the 13th century, temporarily lost Moravia, even, and or at least say not in a fully, in fact, institutionalized way. It was a pretty difficult time. Ottokar was also tied with Brandenburg, the Margrave, which marched into Bohemia when Rudolf marched in as well to take control of the land in securing Ottokar's widow and children's sort of future in that regard, as under an imperial patronage, a Roman patronage. There was yet another big battle to be fought, but the two sides negotiated more cleverly, right? And that's how basically the Habsburgs start, with at least for good in Austria. They start in 1276, and it's basically until, I think in 1290, that Rudolf makes it to properly ensure the inheritance to the Habsburgs, at least different heirs within the same family, to convince, in fact, the German princes to concentrate such great power, at least in the hands of different members of the same house. Moravia had, in part, as we were explaining, not just suffered of the war. Ottokar sent the Bohemians and the Moravians to be slaughtered in the first battle of his army, while he was fighting together with the Saxons from his side in the in the second line. And we don't know what happened in the third, because there were the Poles that also apparently fled during the battle, but it's a bit of a mystery. In any case, that great territory that arrived up to the Adriatic Sea, right? There were even some parts of northeastern Italy. We've seen it in the video about medieval Friuli that were controlled by Ottokar, was permanently divested from Bohemia, right? There will never be another moment in which the Czechs will control that territory. And so we're talking here specifically also Styria, Carinthia, the whole package. Ottokar II's imperial aspirations diverge from those of the Ordenstaat, and they're quite unique in some way. In fact, they incorporated a vision of Western Slavonic unity, right? I remember my tutor, when I wrote that thesis, she said something like, imagine, what would have happened. I didn't like what ifs very much, but say, if, of course, the Battle of Marchfeld had been won by Ottokar, and say Rudolf had died. Aside from the fact we would not had the Habsburgs in the same place that they would eventually have. Because here, for example, the Hohenzollern were already there, but were quite minor. They still, there are very important dynasties that would go on at this point were relatively secondary. Right, the Habsburgs up to that point had been really that as well. But especially if Ottokar had won, which the Germans did not want, by the way, or at least by 1278, the German princes had abandoned Rudolf, except the southeast German ones that didn't quite like him as a powerful ruler, but at least they didn't like Ottokar, at least in that moment. Or there were plots, there were attentive uprisings, etc. But it's a bit of a complicated picture. We will see better on another occasion. Basically, Ottokar would have been at the head, or it's difficult to tell again whether he would have opted for the Roman imperial succession, etc. But he would have been primarily, in any case, a king of Bohemia, right? It's not like there would have not been kings of Bohemia that would also become Holy Roman Emperors. Charles IV of Luxembourg, we made a couple of videos on, was by far one of the single most important characters of his time. and very powerful with a entire, for example, Italian policy. So the capacity of intervention in a wide range of across the entire empire. But in Ottokar's times, you can see, first of all, we're not in a period of crisis. We're still in a period of expansion of some sort. And Germany would have been in ever greater trouble at that point, right? Surely the German princes would have elected somebody else. It would have been some kind of other struggle. It's not like Ottokar would have simply walked into Germany, would have conquered Germany. We know that, of course, it would have sufficed also to be recognized as king of Germany in that sense. At that point, also virtually king of the Romans, at least, to be, let's say, incredibly powerful. He was allied with Charles of Anjou, by the way, which was not a great thing in the moment, especially considering that Rudolf had been elected properly by the Pope, as the Angevins were becoming a bit too pressuring from Naples on the same papacy that was sort of repenting on having backed at least the execution of Conradin back in the day. So it's really difficult to say. Again, I detest what-ifs because they're based on an absolutely immoral, other than unscientific premise. But it's obvious that a Bohemian ruler like Ottokar, even though very, again, Germanizing and sort of very much a man of that broader world of at least of Germany, right? And even, again, also in connection with Hungary, with Poland, at least in different ways, but still crusader and more, would have brought, in fact, to Germany another, would have possibly hegemonized an important part of Germany that may have sort of gradually taken a different direction. There is a letter that I always remember from the thesis that is beautiful and sort of, I don't know how much studied or cited overall, but quite meaningful, were in the winter of 1277, Ottokar is preparing his campaign together with a failed uprising against Rudolf in Austria, asking the Poles for support that, as we were saying before, they will actually provide him with. And the interesting aspect is that the way he addresses the Poles, and there is a completely different language from the one he would have normally used in a broader German context, for example. The German context was obsessed with Romanity. The Germans called themselves Romans. It's all about the empire. It's all about feudal and sort of specifically pious understandings. Ottokar talks to the Poles as if they were almost just some fellow tribal Slavs. He starts talking about probably the ancestors, the common ancestors of the Czechs and the Poles in a broader Slavic sense. He makes references to some kind of ethnic, almost folkloristically sounding kind of identity and sort of cohesion between the two sides. He says basically if the Germans win, also the Poles will fall into their snares and so on. So it naturally we know how it went because the Habsburgs, after Marchfeld, did actually even secure the Kingdom of Poland, which at least nominally the kingship there. And it's a very complicated thing. I'm not going to enter into digression of this because, of course, politics has different degrees, right, of how things happen. There are countries that elect different rulers, like others, just like Germany had partially elected at least the same to the candidate of Ottokar during the election of Rudolf of Habsburg. It's that messed up. It's just you don't hear the stuff unless you actually dig into the sources, which at this point start being incredibly prolific and detailed and sort of rich in ways that are difficult properly to control. The 13th century is sort of the best moment, probably the compromise between sort of the amount of documents available, at least for the degree of, say, of your mental health, and in keeping everything together to reconstruct the system. I live exactly after this, which is worse. for my research in the early 14th century. But it's in many ways also the same time. Not fully, but especially this first generations in the 70s, etc. But it's another dimension of the Middle Ages that when I tell you that on Schwerpunkt, I'm embarrassed because I think that what you actually call niche is, in my view, an incredibly superficial video that compared to all there is really to cover. I realize that the paucity of time of any possibility to ever tell the Middle Ages in an adequate fashion. In the recent survey that I made, you tell me you want to see more medieval content. Yes, we can. But at some point, we should probably enter the bowels of the Middle Ages, and here we're just barely scratching sort of the skin. I don't know why I have come up with this metaphor, but it sort of is visceral enough. Let's put it in this way. And so again, magic time. This is the time of the Minazang. This is the time of Tannhäuser. It's the time of, in fact, it was crusades. It's the time of, the Mongols have already arrived. There is it's the peak of feudalism, of chivalry, of universalism, and yet in this Central European context, it's also a moment of great instability. It's a paradox that is all German, by the way, because there isn't such a thing, say, in in France, in England, in Italy. Things are going fairly well. In Germany, this crisis is big. Like the Great Interregnum is really something that engulfs the entire system, as you can see here from these clashes. And naturally, the Czechs choose to be protagonists, but also, in fact, get the worst of that, as you've seen in the parabola of Ottokar. You can naturally make all the considerations like, Bohemia eventually was defeated. Why? Again, if we don't believe in what ifs, Germany won from the other side as a system, right? And but it literally depended on a flank attack, the Battle of Marchfeld. So they were pretty evenly balanced at that point, powers and realities, at least maybe not in absolute terms, of course, but in that relative extent, expandability that could have made, again, Central Europe hegemonized by Ottokar II of the Premyslids. There are also other passages. For example, there is the Czech Chronica Aule Rege, description of Václav II's coronation as King of Poland in 1300, which was another mechanism on the wake of these exchanges of the collection of crowns that will particularly accelerate in later medieval Europe, but that, as we were saying here, were already a thing. Like the Habsburgs, everybody thinks that they sort of popped up just in the 15th century and before they were a smaller power that eventually became what it became. But the Habsburgs in the early 14th century, the end of the 13th century, were incredibly powerful. They literally had a comparable power, at least in Central Europe, to the one of, saying relative terms, Maximilian of Habsburg will have later on. Also because they could hegemonize Bohemia or have quite a strong influence on Poland at a point. And the Chronica Aule Rege says, on the occasion of Václav II's coronation, was some sort of adventure, wouldn't end well, but that reflected at least this need for political stability. It says, they shall rejoice in one prince, those who speak one language, embracing bonds of closer love, right? So as if Slavonic itself had been, as we were saying also in Ottokar's letter to the Poles, etc., that premise for some greater cohesion of this Western Slavic reality. By the way, I just created a playlist dedicated to the medieval Western Slavs, so if you're interested, you can check that out. So this sentiment deliberately recalled the splendor of the 9th century West Slavonic Empire of Great Moravia, by the way, that we talked about in other videos. It's likely that the so-called Great Moravia was not actually Slovakia, but Serbia,
And we made pretty detailed. I will trigger all my Slovakian followers, but it is actually now the most historiographically credited concept. And I discussed this in the video about both Great Moravia and the foundation, say, the early history of medieval Serbia. And it's not like necessarily here, nor Ottokar II or Václav II had been thinking just, okay, let's remake Great Moravia, also because with Poland it had barely much to do. And Moravia was definitely not the most central place, even within the Kingdom of Bohemia. It's a completely different context. But there had been other premises that evidently were echoing through the words of Ottokar II, for example, while talking about that ancestrally shared bond of Western Slavs, right? In having to fight against the Germans of Rudolf of Habsburg. The Bishop Pandota of Krakow, alluding to the 1255 Prussian crusade with Virgilian eloquence, also because also these Western Slavic courts and churches are becoming really, really educated in by classical standards, stated, quote, those borders, which while referring to the Prussian pre-Christians and the issues that were connected with still the Poles not being able to dislodge the Prussians, having to call the Teutonic Knights, and including also the Bohemians. That's where also Ottokar would go fighting on there. In 1255, Bishop Pandota issued a pastoral letter to the Polish clergy, urging their participation in the aforementioned Prussian crusade, emphasizing the defense of Christian borders against this barbarian incursions. Because indeed, this Baltic peoples were not simply sitting there, right, being conquered, or even just before that, they were normally raiders. Also, the Lithuanians initially were enemies of the Poles in the same way. And I made recently made a video about Poland, Lithuania from the 14th century, but I also made some videos about the old Prussians. We will, if anything, dedicate entire videos about them, because I've never done it. And I know you're going to like it, of course. In any case, while Polish dukes labored to sustain a kingdom beyond the empire's boundaries, it was difficult, especially in Silesia. It was being gradually absorbed and Germanized, like other surrounding parts, by the empire. Czech rulers aimed to exploit, as we've seen, their position within the imperial framework. It's not even like at the time it had been settled. Historically, still by the 12th century, the Germans thought, for example, that Hungary could be conquered and incorporated in the whole Roman Empire. There were some expeditions once by Henry V. We'll talk about those campaigns, because they're really interesting, if anything, even just from... And they're close here to the same market. We follow the Danube, right? It's the Ostmark. It's how the Austrians developed as a feudal country, basically, out of those, in fact... partitions of bigger districts of the empire. I made a video about medieval Austrian warfare, if you're interested, or roughly around this period. It's telling about what that word actually was, because today we, of course, are charmed by the Habsburgic grandeur and history, etc. But otherwise, up to that point, Austria was a pretty anonymous place, right? As we said before, even with Vienna, it was literally a country in theory. And it was a borderland with powerful neighbors as well. There were also kind of barbarian raiders, not just the Prussians that were mostly just in the north, but the Cumans, for example. There were these internal strife, so it was always pretty agitated land. And other boundaries with the steppes, actually. So the boundaries with civilization, you can argue. So... again, it's difficult to explain why Poland itself, that was invaded at some point by the same Germans at the time of Frederick Barbarossa, so they're relatively recent times. And nobody really ever talks about that. There is an interesting chronology about this in the video I made about probably all the dates to learn by heart to at least say that you can attempt to understand medieval Germany, right? yet nobody seems to talk about this. I shall make videos about it. Let's make the difference. Ottokar II sought Polish allegiance for an indissoluble bond of treaty and friendship through appeals to shared ethnicity, as we were recalling before in that letter of 1277, and the veneration of Saint Stanislav, that, as you know, is a bit like a spiritual cornerstone, as a saintly figure for basically all of Central Europe, right? The evangelization of these countries. By the way, newly canonized at this point and designated as the patron of Ottokar's crusade. In 1253, Ottokar II married Margaret of Austria, sister of the last Babenberg Duke, Frederick II, not Frederick II of Ordenstaat, but of Babenberg. Made a video about the Duchy of Austria that looks at all the progression of these wars, and especially these had been great champions of tournaments, of crusades, in the Holy Land, by the way, not just at least in the Baltic. The Babenberg had created the envy of feudal Germany. Babenberg, Austria, was incredibly well administered, was rich, flourishing, growing, as we were explaining before, along this frontier. And this marriage, as we were hinting at before, secured the claim, at least a claim, to Austrian Styria, which significantly bolstered Ottokar's territorial ambitions and legitimacy in the region. By the way, Margaret was much older than him, and they wouldn't have a heir, etc. There would be a problem for that, because also he passed with another wife, but he basically secured as a strong man the control of the local estate, which was also informally the way to rule, the way to go, right? The local Austrian free nobility and the serf ministeriales had a great relevance in this game, because they were probably the military backbone of the land, also against the Hungarians, as we've seen at Kressenbrunn. And they were the ones over the control. The struggle between Ottokar and Rudolf will be played, because there were even some betrayals. Rudolf was a pretty stern and sort of colder ruler than Ottokar. We think it was sort of more energetic and probably an embodiment of magnificence, etc. Rudolf squeezed lots of resources, just like Ottokar had done, telling the truth, but in this sense tightened much more control over the Austrians. At some point began to feel a bit less motivated, and before the Battle of Marchfeld, some sort of through their lengths and left the battlefield, which was also like a matter of great treason. And we will see that the battle is magnificent for many reasons. Now, in 1254, Ottokar was crowned King of Bohemia. He had risen to power in the previous years, already associated to his father with the throne, because the Czech nobility had rebelled against his father, and they had basically used him as a pawn. He had been properly taken as a hostage. He was quite young, and at some point he reconciled himself with the father that elevated him to the throne de facto. But he would never forget how brutal the ethnic nobility of Bohemia would be. In fact, they would become basically his greatest enemy. And that's why he also was so much Germanizing, why he relied so much. This was typical, basically, of all rulers during the Ostsiedlung as well, settling Germans, Jews, founding towns, so doing anything that could properly diminish the local ethnic nobility's power. Many towns were founded by Ottokar, České Budějovice, that was also sending militias at the Battle of Marchfeld, chanting their town's name. It was much in Ottokar's name. He was probably a legendary ruler in his own country and beyond, a marvel for everyone. And as soon as he became king, he also took the cross. This was very important, committing to aid the aforementioned Bishop Prandota in Poland's struggle against non-Christians. Consider that Krakow, that is still, of course, like up to the end of the Middle Ages, the capital of Poland before Warsaw, is also very close to Bohemia, right? It's yet another sort of, and also to Hungary for that matter, which is at the end of the day the reason why he moved after repeated clashes in the 15th century, the capital from there to the Vistula. Sort of better shelter, especially now that there had been the union with Lithuania, because in these times it was more prohibitive. In fact, the Prussian crusade was fought exactly in the same places. Mazovia, just next door to these crusading battlefields, and Baltic warfare is incredibly brutal. In 1255, alongside Bishop Bruno of Olomouc, a very important Moravian center, as you know, also spiritually wise, Ottokar led Bohemian and Moravian forces to Prussia, fighting with alongside the Teutonic Order against the old Prussians. Ottokar baptized 2 subdued Prussian leaders, which is yet another magnificent display of the traditional idea of sacred royalty that we covered in many videos. We've seen it with Frederick II as a Sol Invictus, Philip II Augustus that officiates the Mass before the Battle of Bouvines. There is probably a very, very strongly traditional sense of what kind of power lay rulers can have, and how basically the priestly dimension overlaps at some point. And so that it had been historically a split between the two, but it's not like different individuals do not have that kind of sacred aura on them that therefore makes them shine. Just imagine this. Like, what does it mean to be a Bohemian king of the 13th century? What kind of ideas have you actually been told? We don't often think about this, but that kind of vision of power, of sacred royalty, was very much at the root of tradition, right, with capital T, for not talking about the imperial ambitions, right? And somebody who has himself established at the town of Königsberg, in German, by the way. Of course, well, these were territories eventually not controlled by the Slavs, but by the Teutonic, by the Ordenstaat, that we also recently made more videos of. Again, you know that with a video a day, regardless of how, when I make them or whatever, I'm succeeding in sort of filling many gaps that at this point with 2,500 videos really start profiling the channel as an encyclopedia, right? But we really need to make much more about the Teutonic War. If anything, think about all the relation with the Poles all throughout, not just the later showdown with Tannenberg, etc., but these very beginnings as well. Besides, Ottokar I had taken a liking within this Baltic context, as much as it was associated with Poland as well, with the same Teutonic knights that had risen to great relevance, especially also in the times of Frederick II, was basically the only one who could save, especially the monastic military orders, Outremer possessions, but that had developed and nurtured properly with the Teutonic knights a control, at least, over some parts of the imperial assets in the Baltic, but hopefully creating with a monastic state as opposed to, in fact, a lay one, some sort of more reliable Pope. But the Teutonic knights, in fact, survived the same Hohenstaufen dreams, inspirations, and blood, at least in male line. Ottokar planned a further campaign for 1267, aiming to designate all conquering territories as fiefs at this point of the Bohemian crown and place their churches under the bishopric of Olomouc. This is naturally in a phase where he has conquered an incredibly large amount of land already, And when things were starting to internationally align, also in his favor, especially in the following one, by securing a greater, say, international prestige after the death of Conrad. Consider that the previous year, Manfred of Sicily had been killed, and so just the possibility of reviving some more German-based axis in Italy had waned. But Conradin's blood, as the last of the Hohenstaufens, was really the last drop, let's say, that could be spent against, at least from that family, against. And so the grandeur of Imperial Germany against Ottokar and his ally Charles of Anjou. Naturally, it would have been very difficult for Ottokar to even just impose himself in a military sense in the Baltic and claiming certain fiefs as part of the Bohemian crown just per se. It would have probably been gradually, not just reabsorbed, but there would have been a power-sharing situation, right, for the local powers. In any case, that's also where the connection with Poland is fascinating, because also stepping next to the Teutonic Knights, he was antagonizing a bit with that idea of a centralized Germany for the time standards. In any case, in 1267, Ottokar issued a charter granting the Teutonic Order privileges in the newly founded Königsberg, ensuring at least their loyalty now that essentially the German imperial enterprise was fading, and securing Bohemian influence over the Prussian mission as well. So, as we just said, tensions, antagonisms, but also necessary power sharing and mutual support to have any kind of influence in local. Ottokar's goal was to establish Olomouc as the 13th century northern missionary metropolitanate for Central and Eastern Europe, something comparable to Otto I's Magdeburg back in the 10th century, directly challenging the Polish Archbishopric of Gniezno. So essentially dividing any other power out there and centralizing everything, at least within the lens of the Bohemian crown. This is particularly relevant because it shows that, especially the need to control, for example, the Baltic coast. I mean, Königsberg would go on to be, in fact, quite important center in Prussian history. As such a strategic one, is evidently is the case still today for European balance. So we have to enter also Ottokar's mindset in realizing, for example, how important the Vistula mouth was for power, for income. The Poles were cut off by that because the Teutonic Knights sort of took that over. But if you could, for example, become king of the Romans and increase sort of pressure on Teutonic Knights, you could have much favoritism and almost substitute yourself, or at least participating in that coastal dominion. The same if you obtained the crown of Poland, which was a bit more complicated, but still, given the fractal nature of PS power, the Germanization of Silesia was somehow a possibility. So a great player, Ottokar. In 1268, the bishopric of Olomouc received a papal privilege from Clement IV, granting it exemption from Gniezno's jurisdiction, reinforcing Ottokar's ecclesiastical ambitions. In this phase, it's the same year of Tagliacozzo, right? So at this point, the Pope is still aligned with Charles of Anjou against the revival of a German imperial power. Ottokar, that is, as we've seen, allied with the Angevins, is the ideal candidate for a curial backing, and the pontiff sort of flattens and encourages Ottokar's ambitions, also as far as the ecclesiastical administration of Central Europe and the Baltic was concerned. Things will switch quite soon, and that's why also Ottokar was so triggered by the rise of Rudolf, right? Because that's the moment where the papacy shifts from Naples to Germany once again, and elects this guy that has be a counter-alter to Ottokar that at that point had gained too much power. In fact, also the German princes were sort of starting to freak out. Because one thing is, as always, to sabotage the system when you want to sort of steal stuff for your own without nobody controlling or checking, but it turns out that that's endangering everybody. And in fact, as soon as Ottokar arrives, the Germans want to elect a ruler that is capable of doing something at least against Ottokar and this Bohemian overexpansion. Though, of course, Ottokar's ambitious plans did not come to fruition, and they would have had some sort of important difficulty, right, sort of resistance to, as it in fact historically happened and we're witnessing to now. It still influenced the 14th century Luxembourg king of Bohemia, Emperor Charles IV, in his policies towards Poland and Lithuania. Right? This is sort of a lesser-known aspect because, of course, aside from Bohemia, Charles IV had a very important, of course, German, Italian, French policy that, of course, was more important in the bigger picture. And of course, nobody really liked to expand too much towards Northeastern Europe. It was the least profitable thing. That's why the Germans historically had chosen Rome, Italy. But in that position, and imagine you're in Prague, right? And you have this ventail, or actually double ventail, an entire circle of surrounding options that you will try to equally infiltrate, if anything, to strengthen the center. The Prussian mission and ties with the Teutonic Order invited to the southern Baltic coast by Polish Duke Konrad of Mazovia provided a platform for the three Central European realms to showcase their political religious influence and adherence to contemporary Catholic ideals, given that these Balts were actually a big pain in the behind, as long as they were still there free in an area that was, again, terrifying. In terms, in fact, of governability or anything, but for this reason could not be simply controlled. So it took mostly German colonization rather than the Slavic one, as you know, with a pinch of Scandinavian, to secure especially the Baltic coastline and to essentially tame and destroy all these peoples. The Lithuanians sort of saved themselves in corner for all the reasons that we explained also recently with Ruthenia and eventually the alliance with Poland. And otherwise, the Teutonic Knights were quite coldly and efficiently slaughtering everybody, which was also part of the reason why eventually the Poles and the Lithuanians, being literally enemies, like the Lithuanians were literally this, pre-Christian Baltic barbarians pillaging the Catholic Polish land, because again, the Ordenstaat was the best, and without this massive coalition, there was not much could be done to prevent its spread, right? So you see here Mazovia, as we were saying before, very close duchy to the events, bordering north and east with the pagans. These other Slavs being tied by some sense of at least wanting to be independent from a German direction of the story, which is something they had in common. The Poles, the Bohemians, they were bordering German lands that were really expanding a lot in the northeast, and that was a problem for them. How do you control that? You can exploit that, but you also want to create some nucleus of resistance of some sort. But we'll see better in videos about 14th century Poland. Actually have one incoming if you're interested for our next Slavic, at least sort of broader, let's say approximately Eastern European, a Central European part of the historical regional series branch. Now, the Teutonic Knights had, as you know, had a quite interesting story in all this, because they had defended Hungary's colonizing frontier, the Burgenland, in the Eastern Carpathians, quite efficiently disposing of the Cuman raiders, intruders, so efficiently that the Magyars understood that there would have been soon an Ordenstaat in Transylvania, that I just prepared a video of today for making at some point, maybe during the Halloween special, even though it's not really much connected with, aside from Kraus and Uniati, etc., as you know, we made a video about Dragulia, Vlad Tepes, that was Wallachian. In any case, the title, the brand is there. So in 1226, Andrew II, King of Hungary, expelled the Teutonic Knights, wary of their political ambitions. And we mentioned before Duke Conrad of Mazovia, because he was already around by that time to be the one who actually invited the Teutonic Knights to northeastern, well, depends on how you see, because Poland was sort of gradually also changing shape because of the German colonization, hoping they would shield his territories from Prussian assaults. This ipso facto, Poland at this point was not faring very well in terms of centralization. So there was a system of seniorate similar to the Ruthenians, but there were all these different ducal PS branches that mostly did whatever they do on their own. But it's obvious that if you set foot in places that are Polish anyway, they all fall under the kingly authority. And so in practice, the Teutonic Knights are installed in Poland as vassals of the Polish crown. The Knights secured more lasting support in Bohemia, however, at this point. Paradox, where Ottokar in 1222 had taken their Bohemian and Moravian branches, at least, that did exist under his own protection, unifying both ecclesiastical regions. Against the hope is that by increasing his power in Germany, he will be able to manipulate the Teutonic Knights for his own aims. This is, by the way, Ottokar I, Ottokar II's grandfather, right? So showing that the same policy was pursued by the Bohemian crown for quite a while, right? They had already spotted, especially with the support of the Ordenstaat, and at that point were blessing properly the Teutonic activity, and were allied with the Czechs, as we've seen. Sort of broader coordination in direction of affairs in this area. Of course, it's not like Frederick II was simply seeing the Bohemians as this longa manus, more than beyond their a provincially expandable direction, at least in direct terms. But as we've seen also in other videos about 13th century Bohemia, this was a moment of willing, say, scientific sort of backing of this power to, as an extension, at least in this case, of imperial policy. This is why, after the Hohenstaufen, Bohemia is so well placed, so well put to continue its expansion, especially filling that vacuum left by imperial power. In 1222, Ottokar I also granted the Teutonic Order the right to establish a commander in Bohemia at Duba, providing them with land and resources to strengthen their regional presence. His commitment to the order supported his broader strategy for strengthening ties between Moravia and Prague as well. So it was at this point also an internal mechanism to fasten the connection between the two main parts of the Bohemian crown. From 1230, the Teutonic Order took charge of the Prussian mission as a whole, previously overseen by the Cistercians of Greater Poland, the ones of Lechno, the center in Lechno. That shows again how, of course, this part of Europe was increasingly more under the control of a Germanic direction at the expenses, at least, of the Poles in this case. In 1228, the Polish order of Dobrin was established under Cistercian influence to assist local princes, but it was absorbed into the Teutonic Order itself in 1235. Made video, if anything, about the dress and symbolism of the Order of Dobrin, together with the other branches where other orders were subsumed by the Ordenstaat. In 1234, Pope Gregory IX issued the bull Pietati Proximum, granting the Teutonic Order full control over Prussian lands conquered from these Baltic peoples, formalizing their dominance in the region. It's as if nobody really had cared more than much about this poles, their orders, their control. If anything, the Teutons were more effective, right? And so that was an important medium control also for the papacy over what was happening in the north. You didn't want to let the crusade just becoming an ever more sort of lay enterprise directed by local kings or whatever. The papal medium was quite relevant. The popes were at this point, for example, negotiating, intensely negotiating with the same Lithuanians that were already thinking centuries before the time they actually did that to look at the, let's say, the possibility, let's say, that it's making leverage on the Pope to get something in exchange against promises, sort of plans of Christianization, right? That was a card that you could play as with all the, of course, the disadvantages in coming for other reasons by your choice to remain pre-Christian, in order to be curtailed by this. And I consider the Lithuanians were also eastward oriented at some point. They could have converted to Greek Orthodoxy with alliance ties with the Muscovy. This was true up to the end, like of the initial proper decision of marrying to the Polish house and inheriting, in fact, the same local crown. Right, it was the best choice they could make in that circumstance. Ottokar II successfully cultivated closer relations with Polish dukes himself, though some sought aid from Hungary as well, because they didn't like this over-expansion of the Premyslid in their land. At least Poland was very, as we explained, fragmented. There were different areas of influence. So some Poles eventually went to fight and die with Ottokar at Marchfeld. Others were sort of siding with the Hungarians that were with Rudolf on the other side, as we know, at least the Kumans, because the Magyar oligarchs, as we explained, were not really very easily convincible to make any major military effort for the crown. On their own, yes. For the crown, no. Ottokar II's intervention in the 1259 to 60 Styrian noble revolt against Bela IV reflects this typical regional conflict in Central Europe. I made a video about medieval Styria, and initially Hungary had also exploited the Great Interregnum to essentially take over some of these southeastern German lands, and that's where, in fact, Ottokar receives enough support by stepping into the same land and being a more reliable power, especially for, indeed, Bohemia was, again, closer in a cultural sense to Germany than Hungary. In 1260, Stephen of Hungary and his Cumans attacked Bohemia itself as a retaliation, prompting Ottokar II to appeal to Pope Alexander IV for support against Stephen. Bela, Daniil of Rus and his sons, the Tatars, Boleslav of Krakow, Leszek of Wieżyca, and various southern Slavonic groups. This imposant array that we will look at on another occasion is also the incredibly fascinating response of all a set of literally Central, Eastern, and Southern, you can't even say Slavic, because here there are the Hungarians as well, but mostly Slavic world against Ottokar, that perceived him as a threat and or supported, in this case, the Hungarian effort against him. You see here which ones were with them, with not the connection with Ruthenia through the marriage, with the parentage, also with the last heirs of the Babenberg. It's very complex. If you look at those videos about medieval Ruthenia, the Principality of Galicia, etc., you will find further references to this, because it's all intertwined. That's the beauty of Schwerpunkt. There are lots of intersections, superimposition, and you can understand why all these rulers felt more aligned with Hungary in this struggle than with Ottokar. And you can argue that Ottokar was more efficient, and so he attracted more enmity from the side of more fractal systems. I mean, even Hungary was bigger than Bohemia at this point, was not necessarily more powerful, right? Because of its higher degree of sort of privatization and oligarchization, regardless of the fact that the Magyars had sort of very well resurfaced from the Mongol tide, and were also to remain a might to be reckoned with. And that, in fact, they were the actual horse on which all these smaller powers bet, because they had the power and they could wield it, right, in southeastern Germany, which becomes a battleground. This is the thing that also from a German perspective is quite interestingly disturbing, that here nobody was caring about an emperor, a Roman ruler, whoever. Like this situation, even for if you live in Saxony, if you live at least which part of Saxony, some were supporting, as we said, Ottokar, but in general, even if you didn't care very much about, again, having a strong German ruler, because you were exactly that prince that wanted to seize all the public assets, this thing was not good, right? As a country, as a people, as a nation, you were losing ground. And that's what eventually ends up fueling Rudolf's support. The Dukes of Opole and Silesia aligned with Ottokar at this point, interestingly enough. So also some of the most Germanized parts of Poland do, others don't, because they have been co-opted almost by Ottokar, and they can't participate that power. Also, again, here we're not talking about Bohemians simply stepping in this guy's lands and controlling them. It's just a broader alignment. So we all know, in the end, regardless of Ottokar's death, that it's not like Bohemia would have immediately stepped into a fourth millennium civilization just because of these doings. But of course, it was a very good job and bringing its results. In 1260, Ottokar II secured the support of the Silesian Duke Boleslav the Pious, who provided 1,000 troops for the Bohemian campaign against Hungary, strengthening the Bohemian-Silesian alliance. In fact, also some of the Poles that eventually will support Ottokar 18 years later were coming from Silesia. In any case, they had to pass from Silesia to enter Bohemia from Poland, most of them. But we've seen the Krakowians were normally not aligned with Ottokar. That is also interesting because Krakow, being the heartland of course, of the Polish, was properly the Polish crown, representing the ducal seigniory of the country. Even though, as we've seen, they had aligned with Ottokar for the crusade with local bishop, which was obvious in many ways, were more jealous of his doings and did not really want him to progress that much. In particular, Ottokar's backing of the Teutonic Order in 1255 stirred further unrest in central Poland against Bohemia and its Silesian allies. As long as, again, he was marching with them against the Prussians, it was fine. But as he was, as we've seen, doing more in favor of the Teutonic orders and integrating that system more with the Bohemian one, things were really more complicated. Besides, the Teutonic Knights were already provided with a substantial level of autonomy. If anything, they were just seeking here to exploit whatever came at them to further enhance their power in the Baltic. As we've seen at Kressenbrunn in 1260, Bohemian forces defeated the Hungarians, enabling Ottokar to annex Styria. 9 years later, there was a specific succession crisis that I explained there in the video about medieval Styria. 9 years later, Ottokar becomes also Duke of Carantania. I made a video about that too. That's when Ottokar adopts the titles of 5th King of Bohemia, Duke of Austria, Styria, Carantania, Margrave of Moravia, Lord of Carinthia, the Mark of Cheb, and Pordenone. This is fascinating because he sort of put Bohemia, Austria, Styria, and Carantania before Moravia. That was a Bohemian crown land, right? Also, you see here again the aforementioned territories in northeastern Italy, the connections with the Patriarch of Aquileia. So you see there is really a pretty far-ranging reach. There is Prussia, Poland, Bohemia, Germany, Italy, and so this is really a big deal. During the rivalry between Ottokar II and Rudolf of Habsburg for the rule over Germany rather than the imperial throne per se, the Henrik Fiak of Nemeth-Vari considered supporting the Czech king, while the Czech backed Rudolf. These were Magyar factions, as you understand from the names, very powerful Hungarian clans, witnessing to the fact that, of course, Hungary was participating to the struggle, and not just univocally against the Bohemians. Because, as we said, there was more pro-monarchic faction, as we will see. Also, the dealings between Rudolf and the King of Hungary will not be too easy, right? Just had an enemy in common mostly. And in 1273, the Henry Fiak of Nemeth-Vari pledged 500 knights to Ottokar II's cause at a council in Pressburg, that is today's Bratislava, the capital of Slovakia, though their support wavered after Rudolf's election. So you see how sort of unstable the picture really was. So you have the capacity of, let's say, taking a stand for mere convenience from Upper Hungary. But when a new German leader shows up, oh, wait, sorry, I will withdraw. Also because 500 knights is really a lot, right? Even though you can think that the Hungarians stereotypically had sort of slightly lighter cavalry, at this point they were very westernized in many ways. But we made a video also about the 13th century Hungarian knight, and naturally there were lots of things here that, as we just seen in the example, could be simply promised but not provided. 500 knights is an incredibly large force, even for such powerful clans. Right, only a kingdom can field like Ottokar will be able to do with all that enormous power behind him. Thousands of knights, actual knights, by the way. Not like, I don't know, the Hungarians could field lots of Kumans who were sort of horse archers at the end of the day. But they had that too. They had in this case a more united front internally. Following Ottokar II's death in 1278, Bohemia was governed by Margrave Otto of Brandenburg. He was born in 1244 and died in 1298. The late king's brother-in-law as regent for Václav II, right? At least this was regulated with Rudolf. That was the first one to control the thing, and just Brandenburg. I made a video about the Margravate, if you're interested, sort of stepped into the situation among the various things, because, again, massive power vacuum in Bohemia. Ottokar, as we've seen, was just a huge figure, right? He really incarnated some models of knighthood, chivalry, sacred royalty, crusade, nobility, ancestral Slavic blood, too much, right? His death was really a massive tragedy. It was felt as an enormously as meaningfully loaded divine judgment of some sort in front of the rise of the Habsburgs that, as you know, would change world history forever. Starting from there, and so also a more Roman and Germanic model that at that point was winning compared to these other countries as well, regardless of the fact that we're still in an age of substantial expansion. And it's not like the Brandenburgers were particularly tender-hearted. They were quite opportunistic. They had been allied with Ottokar II. Well, in 1283, Otto of Brandenburg, we had taken this sort of tutorate, imprisoned the same Václav II in Bezdesz Castle to secure his regency for himself, basically. But this act provoked resistance from Bohemian nobles, because it's not like they had all died in Marchfeld. Ottokar II had himself sort of attempted to cause that, as a matter of fact, just to have more monarchic power there. But obviously we're in the 13th century, we can't exterminate even in a canon establishment, as literally that was the case back in the day. And basically the Czechs rise and lead to Otto's eventual expulsion back to Brandenburg. These frontiers are fascinating, aren't they? I mean, they will continue. I've seen them also between Charles IV and Brandenburg, and lots of incredibly fascinating attempts of hegemonization at that point of Brandenburg from the side of Bohemia. In 1284, the Brandenburg regent was ousted, thus, and local nobles led by Zawisz of Falkenstein, the second husband of Ottokar's widow, and Bishop Tobias Bacon of Prague assumed control. This was an important step. It was still Premyslid blood to patron, to tutor. Zawisz of Falkenstein married Ottokar's widow Kunigunda in 1285. There's a very sad history about, if anything, she lived on, of course, but there was all an issue with the body of Ottokar because different reasons after the battle, and it wasn't given to her up until pretty late, and nobody really knew whether it was him because he had been disfigured by the wounds. There was almost this Arthurian legend of the fact that Ottokar was also yet another Deus absconditus. He had transfigured in holy combat at Semele, and so Rudolf himself had to properly measure the stature of this monarch, right? He had crushed, but that never really had the satisfaction of fully, let's say, identifying the body that he exposed. Oh, and this was also an international stand. Like, they had to show that Ottokar had died. It was very important historically. Also for juridical reasons. I mean, if you didn't really prove that the king had died, you couldn't recognize this corpse. You hadn't fully achieved victory in a sense. But that was sort of just a secondary aspect of this, the ultimate Habsburgic takeover, right? At least in southeastern Germany, sort of very different dimensions that at that point departed from even just the fate of such an excellent king like Ottokar. And as far as Zawisz of Falkenstein, he basically consolidated his influence over the Bohemian regency until execution in 1290 for treason, which also is fascinating. Again, like exchange of courtesies, rebellions, assassinations, brutalizations of different sort, and that's history. That's the world. That's how things eventually go in many ways, and this is what we're witnessing in history. I'm really glad to have made this video because, like, man, it is fascinating, isn't it? This stuff is really something, and let's be honest, nobody knows this. I mean, if you're an expert about Ottokar, if you have this level of brainstorming that we make on Schwerpunkt is quite unique. But if you have properly the choice, the chance, if anything, of explaining this history, you're gonna get so much out of it. So much. I mean, think about all the other videos we made about medieval Bohemia. This is beautiful. I mean, this is a period in history you can't but fall in love with. I personally love the 13th century the most, even though I specialize in the later phase. But man, the 13th century is the deal, is the actual deal. And what can you do about that? It's beautiful just to do this job. I mean, the more I go on, honestly, I'll tell you, the happier I am that I'm a historian. I wouldn't choose anything else, knowing how cool this is. This is literally what I wanted to do, and I thought, well, maybe it can be a hobby or whatever. Instead, it was the best, among the best choices of my life, let's put it in this way. What to say? You've seen the level of depth, say, aside from the various levels of interaction, but the deeper meaning of Ottokar's rule, even just as a Slavic leader, right, as a royal noble blood, as a spiritual, military, national figure and beyond. Like this is the peak of universalism, and you have this apparently defiled position of Bohemia that instead at this point turns out to be for a while, in fact, the greatest power within the same Holy Roman Empire. And it is really insane and beautiful and interesting. And again, we will see this better in other videos, but today was really special, right? And I don't know how much you share, how you find my content, but please especially watch the top 6 comments, because through that you can get a pretty concrete idea of how much there is that we've made of similar and adjacent, if you want. Like if you want to look at, as we're seeing here, like for example, the history of the Habsburgs, well, we will actually get more into that and more. And the whole system matters. Just yesterday we made that video about the Ayyubid Syrian heavy cavalryman from Mosul in the 20s of the 13th century. We would say, oh, Schwerpunkt, but what's wrong with your head sometimes? Well, it is that it's part of the puzzle, isn't it? And if you don't cover that, you don't cover some parts of it that give you properly the sense of depth behind history. If we didn't find this, we didn't have this, we wouldn't, if we didn't cover really these particular topics, we would not be capable of stepping up in other ways. We wouldn't explain why this topic is so important, so deep, so far-reaching, right? This is all what truly matters. And again, it is incredibly relevant, and I'm really glad that we had the opportunity of really talking about this. So stay tuned for more medieval Czech history. For today, however, we stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.